Street Fighter is finally getting a confirmed reboot, with a fantastic cast of actors taking on the iconic roles from the games. With the decades-long run of the franchise, it's worth exploring its fascinating history, from its creation to its execution and subsequent expansion across other media. Let's take a look at some absolutely insane and mind-blowing facts about the Street Fighter franchise.
No, not Guile.
The origin that had Sonny Chiba and a manga. Sonny Chiba has long influenced cinema, with his movies making the western side, featuring some crazy dubs and notable title changes. If you don't know the actor, you must remember his iconic role as Hattori Hanzo in Kill Bill, a byproduct of Tarantino's pure love for him. But you would be surprised to learn that the title of the now iconic game comes from a 1974 martial arts powerhouse film featuring Sonny Chiba himself, titled Clash, Killer Fist. You see, the American release of the film was titled The Street Fighter, and it was one of the first films to receive a US theatrical rating of X for the level of violence it depicted. But then there's the iconic story of the game itself, a staple of many franchises and games over the years. The Ultimate Tournament arc is the common one, but the storyline that follows it for Ryu has been very much inspired by a manga that garnered significant attention at the time. If you like the basic storyline for Street Fighter, you have to thank Karate Master, as the arc of Yoshiji Soeno is where Ryu was picked from, even in terms of character design.
And at the same time, the villain from the manga, the eye patch-wearing Muay Thai fighter Reba, was the clear inspiration for Sagat.
Guinness World Record. Street Fighter might have dominated the arcades, esports, and even your gaming console, but that's not where the franchise stops, because in March 2020, Guinness World Records recognized Street Fighter as the most prolific fighting video game series, with a total of 177 gaming titles, including ports, editions, spin-offs, compilations, sequels, and prequels. The franchise traces a 35-year legacy of continuous reinvention, but the list doesn't even include the various crossovers where the characters were brought into similar themed games, or the block puzzle game, because including those would take the number to around 236. It's not every day that you get to witness a franchise built on such mass popularity that it continues to expand. Every minor version since the first game has tried to push the envelope by moving into handhelds and mobiles, and creating super deformed avatars of the characters, clarifying that it's meant to have a long-lasting legacy. The character arcs and the gameplay have also grown into other formats, but that just needs its own pointer. So the next time you're sitting at your PC or gaming console, trying to pit Ryu or Ken against another fighter, remember you're playing with what's essentially gaming history. Zangief got toned down. Zangief was a lot more brutal than the version we saw, based on the response to the demo versions, according to designer Akira Nishitani. For Zangief, there was his headbutt move. It still remains now as a normal attack, which you can perform by jumping straight up, then holding up and pressing punch. Originally though, he would toss his opponent up into the air, then headbutt him from below as he fell back down. For various reasons, we couldn't include it though. At one point, Zangief was actually the strongest character. Now that strength only exists in legend. In our planning docs, we'd written that he had high defense, but it was way too strong. No matter how many times you hit him, he just wouldn't die. And on top of that, he dealt a lot of damage too. What would usually happen is that the matches would time out, and most of the time he'd win that way. So we made him a little weaker, but I'm afraid we overdid it. We really wanted all the characters to be equal in strength. Movies and a rock opera. You know you've hit the fan base when your game leaves the arcade and moves into other media, particularly movies. Street Fighter has lived in the hearts of fans through live-action films, international animated shows, bootleg parodies, and even a rock opera. Yes, a rock opera. In fact, this particular media deserves deeper digging than one might imagine, because, apart from the now cult 1994 film, the game also got a wacky time travel take in the 1993 film Future Cops, which was loosely inspired by the game's cast and mechanics. At the same time, the 1995 to 97 animated series blended the characters and plots from the games. And then there was Man Factory, a gut punch to those who think that the fight game franchise couldn't spawn a musical, as the indie rock band managed to make a 3-album rock opera titled Street Fighter Round 1 through 3. This was a narrative about Ken's romantic troubles, while Chun-Li went on her quest against M. Bison. These varied adaptations prove one thing pretty well: the arcade puncher didn't just entertain, but it also punched right through the screen. Final Fight, the unofficial Street Fighter 2. Talking about the various versions of the franchise expansion, we can't forget the sequel that was pushed aside, Final Fight. According to developer Akira Nishitani, the 1989 game Final Fight was supposed to be Street Fighter 2, and it was even given the name Street Fighter 89 until they settled on Final Fight. Because of the okay job that Street Fighter did in the market, Capcom wanted to target a second game for the American market, and Nishitani explained, Since the beginning, Final Fight was intended for America. Since fighting games were selling well in America, we designed it, following all the conditions to make a hit, like interrupting the flow of the game as little as possible, putting a map on the screen so you can understand where you are or how far you have to go. In the beginning, we began working on Final Fight as a sequel to Street Fighter, but at that time, Double Dragon was very popular, so we shifted to a game of that type. So we made Final Fight expressly for America. But when I went there for a business trip, they told me a one-on-one fighting game in the vein of Street Fighter would have sold better. I was like, hey, really? But that doesn't mean the game completely left the canon, because both worlds share continuity, with Cody, Guy, and Hagar appearing in Street Fighter Alpha and Street Fighter 4. Even Mad Gear became canonized in the Street Fighter lore as one of the most grounded crime-driven stories. Strangest woman in the world. Before 1991, fighting games focused on a single warrior that players could control and navigate through the game with. In Street Fighter, it was Ryu who became this warrior, while there was also the option to join as Ken. But their moves and fighting patterns were very similar. When Street Fighter 2 came out, it completely changed how these games worked, by offering 8 distinct characters for players to choose from. But what really changed this gaming landscape was the inclusion of Chun-Li, the very first playable female character in a fighting game. The fact that she was in league with all these other male characters and an animal we'll talk about later actually made her finishing boast, "I'm the strongest woman in the world," echo through the game. But this representation didn't go as smoothly as it seems, because the character's development had to overcome some really interesting hurdles. During discussions about creating this character, one developer protested that Chun-Li's health bar should not be kept the same as the other characters. According to this person, women are not stronger than men, and they should actually have a shorter health bar, making it easier for the character to be defeated by reducing the damage she can take. But this opinion was easily removed, as the other designers stood by the idea of an equal health bar, and that's what ended up showing up in the game. Amazingly, the character became so popular that Jackie Chan himself dressed as her for a fight sequence in the 1993 movie City Hunter. Cheap tricks. At one point, the game was supposed to cost only 32 cents per play, an idea that Capcom executives later cancelled. According to producer Yoshiki Okamoto, "I still think we would have changed the whole gaming sphere. A quarter, a nickel, and 2 pennies per play? Just imagine. Imagine how the response would have been to this slick move." Dan Hibiki, the joke that became a legend. In the Street Fighter world, Dan Hibiki recognizes himself as the king of Saikyo, and over the years, this crazy character has managed to gain quite a bit of attention for himself. But that wasn't supposed to be the case with him, because unlike most other characters and their origins, Hibiki was supposed to be a jab at SNK after they had released Art of Fighting, because the characters of Ryu Sakazaki and Robert Garcia from Art of Fighting were too similar to Ryu and Ken. Capcom created Hibiki. Now, if you look at Hibiki and his exaggerated character design, it almost feels like a mockery of Ryu's attire because the character's features feel absolutely unreal. But once the character debuted in the game, he started getting a lot of attention for his overconfidence and weirdly funny backstory. Even though the fans might not have made light of what was going on in the creators' minds, the character turned out to be a surprising success and is still part of some discussions about the game. Funnily enough, the upcoming Street Fighter movie has roped in comedian Andrew Schultz to play Hibiki, and even though we're looking forward to the jokes, let's see if they make the meta commentary about the jab in the movie. Blanka, from Office to Amazon. Blanka might be one of the most odd-looking characters in the game because of the feral and beast-like appearance. But the electric green beast was actually based on a real person, loosely inspired by Hal Blanka Blankenship, a mailroom employee known for his excessive body hair. The character had every reason to be iconic, but the joke might have gone too far with the guy because Hal soon left the company and mysteriously disappeared, even though the character had managed to make an identity of its own with the love from the players. Now, Blanka's character wasn't supposed to be a martial artist like Ryu or Chun-Li, but instead, he was a creature. When you beat the game, his true story cracks open as he reveals his identity, a boy named Jimmy who survived a plane crash in the Amazon. Capcom also had a reason for the iconic appearance, tying it to the idea that he was exposed to electric eels. A really bizarre origin story, but a memorable one nonetheless. Between Blanka and Lobo, Jason Momoa is undoubtedly having as much fun as we can imagine. The name switch. As we can see so far, the creators behind the game were very much inspired by pop culture. And in fact, for Street Fighter 2, they had to back out of a planned reference in fear of a lawsuit. The intimidating boss guy, M. Bison, managed to establish himself as a central character with his debut in Street Fighter 2. But would you believe that in Japan, this character was called Vega? Why? The character who was initially called M. Bison was given the name Balrog during the American release. If you look at the character carefully, you'll definitely notice that the character is very much influenced by the famous boxer and Hangover star star Mike Tyson. Even the name M. Bison is clearly a play on Tyson's name. It was during the game's release abroad that Capcom feared a lawsuit from Tyson and decided to change the characters' names, with the Spanish fighter becoming Vega, while M. Bison became the big boss, and the original Bison became Balrog. Only Sagat managed to keep his name. But since then, the game has gained significant popularity, and fans have been able to connect with Mike Tyson. In fact, a few years back, Tyson was told about this connection, and he was really impressed by the character, and said that he was honored by the impersonation. So it wasn't going to be much trouble anyway, but Capcom still didn't want to take the chance. You never know. The mystery of Sheng Long. In the early years, it became pretty clear to arcade game fans that the translation in the Japanese games were absolutely terrible. In fact, many of these poorly translated terms and elements became fun references for fans over the years. But there's one mistake that has become a lot more iconic in comparison to most of these other ones, and that's entirely because this mistake managed to spawn a completely new character in the game. With most post-fight celebrations having a flavor of their own, Ryu's, as he declared, "You must defeat Sheng Long to stand a chance," from Street Fighter II absolutely stood out. Why? Because no one knew who this Sheng Long was or how to defeat him. Over time, people accepted that he must have been a mentor to both Ryu and Ken. But the true story indicates that the whole Sheng Long line was actually a poor translation of "You must defeat my Shoryuken," and Sheng Long was supposed to refer to his Dragon Punch. Now, Capcom could have clarified things, but instead they decided to play along with the fan theory and eventually introduced a Sheng Long-like character, Gouken, who was Akuma's elder brother. Let's smash some cars. One of the most incredible and yet random details in Street Fighter II had players unleash their fury on the helpless vehicle as a bonus stage between matches. With some of the biggest details in the game being brought up in a boardroom as a result of several brainstorms, it's really cool that this bonus feature was not drawn out of these roundtable discussions. Yoshihiro Matsui and his team of programmers drew real-world inspiration for this feature and used it perfectly in the game. In his words, "We made Street Fighter 1 in a kind of bad part of town, and one night when we came out, there were a bunch of guys betting on how quickly this drunk dude could total my car with his hands and feet. I still don't think I understand how the wagering worked all the way, but we put it into the game. So there you go. One of the first moments from a game where players get to interact with a background object directly, and for some of us, it's probably as real as it gets during a tournament like that. What began as a bet became one of the most awesome moments in a game, a beautiful addition to the absurdity of the Street Fighter franchise. Cool anime moves. Some of us might be wondering whether the core of the game runs deep into Japanese pop culture, and what makes that really obvious is the presence of the legendary special moves that pop up everywhere. At a time when fighting games were making their mark in the arcades, Street Fighter stood out with the iconic moves from the characters that the players would end up copying in real life. Designing such unique moves takes a lot of effort and research, and it seems that Takashi Nishiyama was digging for the right material that would make it through. While talking about the iconic Fireball and Dragon Punch, Nishiyama added, "I was inspired by anime and manga from the time. So for example, the Hadouken was inspired by a Japanese anime called Space Battleship Yamato. In that show, the battleship had a laser missile called Hado-Ho. It collects energy and then blasts it into space, destroying the enemy. That's where I got the idea for the Hadouken. The Shoryuken and Tatsumaki Senpukyaku were original ideas. I took martial arts moves and exaggerated them so that they looked like special attacks. Next time you're watching an anime, remember to make note of the cool moves. You never know when they might come in handy." Punching bag for strength check. Even though some people continue to highlight significant developments in the game introduced to arcade gaming technology, the most critical innovation has to be the 6-button feature. Nishiyama wanted each player's attacks to have 3 versions: weak, medium, and heavy. Yep, he managed to bring out 6 attack strengths, rather than the traditionally limited 2. Even though it felt like it would be a tough sell with the sales team saying it would increase the difficulty for playing, Nishiyama pushed the development teams to make it. But did you know that Nishiyama originally wanted a punching bag to be an arcade accessory that would completely replace the ideas of buttons? According to him, my biggest contribution was pushing for the 8-directional joystick with 6 buttons. But initially, I created a cabinet that used pressure sensor mechanics. At the time, Capcom didn't have any experience making large arcade machines, only tabletop games, and we had a mission to make a large machine. So we worked with Atari to make a punching bag where the game used pressure sensor mechanics to measure the player's punch strength. Unfortunately, that didn't sell too well because it was expensive, and it had a low replay value because playing the game was exhausting. On top of that, Capcom didn't have expertise in selling large machines, so we shifted our direction and went for the joystick and buttons. Eventually, when the game became successful, Capcom brought out a version of the punching bag with a deluxe cabinet featuring 2 rubber pads for punching and kicking. The idea was entirely inspired by Nishiyama's concept, and the strength with which the pads were hit translated into the strength of their attacks. But the pads wore out, and the deluxe version faded away into gaming history. Ready Player One would have come sooner if this had been a success. Accidental combo. Street Fighter II was the one that made the gaming franchise a popular one across the world, and that's because of the various moves it made in terms of an arcade gaming experience. Before this one, most fighting games had a primitive take on fight mechanics, with clean, isolated exchanges between players, with the idea of one strike, score, and reset. So as you can see, there's no space for any type of improvisation or fluidity that would have made it feel a bit more real. The victory at the end of the fight came down to reaction time, without any semblance of rhythm. Although this must sound absolutely bizarre, considering Street Fighter II came along and changed everything with one mistake. The combo attacks, which seemed to give the idea of a more random nature to the fights, weren't actually designed into the system. Still, it was because of a particular glitch that some of the moves, if timed accurately, could link together before the enemy had a chance to prepare a block. Developers thought of it as a bug and didn't give it much thought, since the players would hardly care about it. The arcade players instantly recognized this secret and decided to chain these attacks together, building what became a fluid, unbroken barrage. This combination of moves would later be called the combo, and this bug made Street Fighter II much better than most games of the time, adding to the excitement. Capcom, who clearly seems to be enjoying the response from its players, embraced this glitch and made it a core mechanic. So the next time you're playing a game with a noob and they defeat you by randomly clicking different keys, you know where the hate should be directed. A hacker's game. After the success of the sequel, Capcom released Street Fighter II Champion Edition in 1992, with changes that many felt cosmetic, with nothing really special coming out of it. The game now allowed players to play as the 4 boss characters, but that didn't really open a new chapter. Given the idea of making a significant update that could make waves, the response was really underwhelming. In fact, it was somewhat bothersome, since it required a new arcade cabinet rather than just installing new software to apply the update. That made it a hassle for both players and the business owners. Then came the hackers, who stole the Street Fighter code and altered its function to create a faster, more complex gameplay experience. In fact, the most popular of these versions was the Street Fighter II Rainbow Edition, a bootleg that sped up gameplay and introduced notable air moves and devastating combos. These editions gained much popularity, and later, Capcom tried to see how the game worked once these updates were removed and realized why fans were enjoying this version. So Capcom learned a lesson and brought in a version called Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, with many elements inspired by the hackers' work, making for an update that could indeed work. In the end, the bootleg did pay off. Guile's flat top. The one thing that was most missed because of the creative liberties taken in the 1994 film was Guile's bold hairstyle. This hairstyle has become one of the most incredible aspects of the character, and even though it looked like an iconic achievement for Capcom, the design turned into a nightmare for developers, as they tried to implement it into the game's code. In fact, 3 programmers were fired from the team for their inability to get the digital hair to work. Now, when you look at it, the style has definitely become a symbol of his unwavering commitment to his country. Like DC's Peacemaker, the exaggerated hairstyle actually fits his persona really well, and the material from Capcom suggests that it requires a special order army hairspray to keep it up, even though we've seen him fixing his hair after fights. Capcom has apologized a lot for the impact this had on pop culture, with many people trying to pull it off and failing miserably. In 2017, the Japanese cosmetic brand Zangief featured Guile himself to promote their J-Gel hair product, and the character himself stated, "A disturbed hairstyle leads to disorder of the heart. It's not cool." I don't think anyone would disagree with him though. Halloween fads. The games had a massive cultural impact, and Guile's hairstyle wasn't the only thing that was taking everyone's attention anymore. Everything from the costumes to the voices became things that kids wanted to copy and be. While Ryu and Ken were the obvious choices, the players were a lot more interested in the obscure characters. In fact, E. Honda had such an influence that gaining weight to pull off the character for Halloween back in 1991 had become a dangerous fad. Fatal Fury, the spiritual successor or a split timeline. Apart from the 6-button feature, there was a lot that didn't make it to the final product that Nishiyama was trying to make. He felt the characters lacked depth, and wanted to polish them and add special attacks for each. But by the end, these plans were removed, and we got to see the combo attacks instead of the special attacks. And we're satisfied with that. But Nishiyama wasn't done. He took his concepts and poured them into SNK's Fatal Fury, the next project he was heading. In his own words, "There were a lot of things that didn't make it in, but I was headhunted by SNK after its release, and many members of the development team and I moved over. So we went on to make Fatal Fury, and we put in a lot of things that we couldn't in Street Fighter. So for me, Fatal Fury is my Street Fighter 2. And the actual Street Fighter 2 was created by someone else at Capcom after I left. So that's where the vision for Street Fighter diverged. The continuation of Street Fighter that I had in mind with Fatal Fury, and the Street Fighter 2 that Capcom created. Calling Fatal Fury a spiritual successor could be too much, but we'd love to visit a world where Nishiyama brought his ideas for the characters' backstories to life. Rival Schools Influence. The third entry in the Street Fighter arcade games was the 1995 release, Street Fighter Alpha, which would go on to become a trilogy that introduced significant gameplay changes, serving as a prequel to Street Fighter 2. 2, with younger versions of the characters and others from the first game. But what was distinct about it was its art style, which Capcom had employed in Darkstalkers and X-Men Children of the Atom. But game designer and creator Hideaki Itsuno managed to shed some light on the developments that changed how players saw Capcom. According to him, Rival Schools was a game where we put a lot of effort into making sure it was easy to play. First, you had the 4-button system, as opposed to the 6-button system for Street Fighter. We did this with the thinking that the game would be ported to PlayStation. We also made it easy to do combos without having to know special moves. And we put in counters too. I think our big selling point was the team attacks you did by pressing 3 buttons at once. You started the fight with maximum gauge, so you can even do it right at the beginning. That helped increase our income, and Street Fighter Alpha 3 even incorporated it. Yeah, they copied it, but they asked our team for permission first. Surnames ahoy! Fans remember the 1994 film not as the best work depicting the gaming franchise in all its glory, but as the strangest interpretation of the games. One of the boldest choices the game made was giving the iconic characters players had been chilling with full names, rather than the ones in Capcom's canon. Guile became Colonel William F. Guile, with Van Damme taking on the role, while Ryu was added with a Hoshi, and Chun-Li became Chun-Li Zhang. We need more characters. The 2025 Street Fighter film has confirmed 17 characters in the cast, with some really big names joining in for some of our favorite characters. I mean, Jason Momoa is taking on Blanka, and that's already a significant achievement for the film. But the 1994 film didn't actually pick on so many characters, even though Capcom wanted Steven E. D'Souza to bring 19 of them in the movie. The director explained, "I convinced them that there should only be 7 main characters by asking, can you name the 7 wonders? Can you name the 7 dwarves? There's a reason all of these things are 7, because it's a number that most people can keep in their heads. No one could name all 7, by the way. They can only get up to 6. The dwarf everyone forgets is bashful. Anyway, that worked for a while. But as the movie went on, they kept asking, can you add another character? And another? And as late as the last month of filming, they added another character. There was the Bruce Lee-like character Fei Long that had been added into the game. So in the end, I think the picture was really overpopulated. It's a 100-minute movie, and there are about 15 characters. Do the arithmetic. It would have been much better with fewer characters. Taking on 17 characters does seem like a bold choice, managing so many big names. But then we know it will definitely make for a good watch in the end. JCVD left Mortal Kombat, and in 2023, Jean-Claude Van Damme joined Mortal Kombat as one of the playable characters, stepping into a franchise that had actually taken his likeness as an inspiration for the character of Johnny Cage. The actor was also set to take on the role in the 1995 film, but he left it for Street Fighter, where he played Guile, offering a new take on the character that was somewhat different from what players might have expected. The movie actually made Guile the protagonist, a unique choice that didn't really help the film become a significant success. I mean, we can't really imagine Van Damme and his weird performance as Ryu. It would somehow have been more bizarre than we already got. According to the director of the 1994 film, Capcom did want Jean-Claude Van Damme from the get-go, I guess because he resembled the Guile character. We were resistant to that idea, saying the audience would expect an R-rated movie if we had Jean-Claude in it. And he also has an accent. But of course, the accent was completely unknown to Capcom because when they see Jean-Claude's movies in Japan, he's dubbed. So that didn't mean anything to them. They figured he had an American accent. However, they were adamant about having some star power, which is why we got Jean-Claude, even though it creates the expectation of an R-rated movie. And Raul Julia. They were thrilled to get an actor of that caliber. Luckily, Raul Julia took on the role, one of his final, because of the love his kids had for the game. There's no way you can forget his performance in the movie once you see it. And JCVD had fun. Van Damme wasn't in the best of places in his life during the making of Street Fighter, and he was in fact making the most of it, along with the coke that he had been addicted to at the time. The director has quite a story about working with the actor. As he mentions, one of my producers at the time had an Italian guest star, and he suggested that I take him to lunch and run lines with him, as I may have inadvertently given him a tongue twister. So when I worked with Arnold for the first time, I said, if it's okay with you, I'd like to work on your lines because I may have inadvertently given you a tongue twister. And he leapt on this and said, that's a great idea, Steven, because people don't realize some words are hard for me to say. So I went to his house and I ran through the whole Commando script with him, and if we got to a difficult line, we'd replace it. This worked so well on Commando and The Running Man that for the next picture Arnold did, Raw Deal, the scriptwriter didn't do this with Arnold. I remember one review said something strange is going on with Arnold Schwarzenegger. His English was getting better and better over the past 2 pictures, and now it's worse. Anyway, I suggested I do this with Jean-Claude, and he said, no, I did the lines with my wife last night. It's perfect. It's all fine. So I never got him to do it with me, but we got on set and he would stumble over lines. One particular line I remember was, see you later. So he's acting and he says, I'll see you later. And I say, cut, that's fine. And he says, no, Steven, can we do it again? I did not say later, I said ladder. I told him he hadn't, but he was convinced that he had and didn't want to be embarrassed by accidentally saying ladder. So I play the tape back and he said later. So he says, my bad, let's do it again. I say, go. He says, I'll see you later. So it was an ongoing thing. Also, Jean-Claude has since confessed he was having substance abuse problems at the time. In fact, the insurance company for the film made us hire a wrangler who was meant to keep Jean-Claude out of trouble. But it ended up going the other way around, and Jean-Claude got the wrangler in trouble. There were also so many mornings where Jean-Claude would call in sick. Subsequently, he's confessed he wasn't sick. He was on his back after a wild night of partying. So there were a number of times when we were ready to film and there was no Jean-Claude, and I had to make up stuff, literally on the spot, for the other characters to do, which tilted the entire balance of the movie away from him and onto the other numerous characters. Major success. Apart from changing everything for the gaming world with the release of Street Fighter II, the franchise proved to be one of the most significant achievements ever. Just from arcade revenue alone, the game had generated around $1.5 billion, and the number of arcade cabinets developed reached 200,000 by 1995. But then came other formats, and in 1992, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System released a new version of the game that sold over 6.3 million copies, making it one of the most successful software titles. So the innovation and work behind the franchise didn't get undermined even once, and it all led to a happy ending, with the ending not coming anytime soon. Marvelous verdict. It's fantastic to see how a game has become an essential part of pop culture, while referencing major pop culture events itself. With the upcoming movie and Capcom's interest in building a franchise of the movies, there's a lot more that can still be spun out of this world.